Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, perfectly.
Wonderful. Welcome to the Youth Brain Trust Podcast, YBT Podcast. My name is Joe Shepard. I am proud to present the Right Honorable Kim Campbell, 19th Prime Minister of Canada. How are you doing this morning, or in your case, evening?
Very well, thank you.
Well, that's good to hear. So, originally, I had a few questions prepared for this brief interview, just broadly about your time serving Canada. But in the wake of these horrible shootings in El Paso and Dayton, I thought that maybe we could change the topic to that. As Attorney General of Canada, I believe you spearheaded a lot of the gun control legislation that they currently have today. And I was just curious if the American people could learn anything from that, kind of how you did it and what we have to learn. Because a lot of the times Canada is ahead of us socially, and this is definitely a situation like that.
I think one of the important things to reflect on is that, first of all, in Canada, we have a lot of guns. We didn't have a frontier in our history, so we don't have this myth, and I think it is largely a myth of the, people having to, take the law in their hands. In Canada, as settlement spread west, it was accompanied by law and order. So there are a lot of ways in which our gun culture is different. Gun control as an issue is, in fact, a very difficult issue in Canada. As I say, it's a sensitive issue. When I became Justice Minister, I was told that it was probably a more difficult justice issue than abortion, which is also dealt with quite differently in Canada. But there are several things that I brought in mind when I dealt with the issue. When I became Justice Minister, my predecessor had already been reviewing the state of our gun laws because we had this was in 1990, and in the late 60s, we'd had quite a revision of our firearms laws. And many of the provisions that were put into law had not actually been properly implemented, and others were being evaded. So, for example, when we had outlawed automatic firearms, people were now importing semi-automatic firearms that could be converted to automatic fire. There had been provisions requiring a certain kind of training before you could buy a firearm. That had never been implemented because in Canada, our criminal law is federal, but the provinces have to implement it. So there were a number of ways in which the firearms legislation was deemed by my predecessor to be ready for a revisit. But then, just before I became minister, an event happened which, like the mass shootings in the United States, changed the political climate. And that was the shooting at École Polytechnique in Montreal of 14 young women engineering students by a man named Marc Lepine. And he took a Ruger semi-automatic firearm with the two 30-shot magazines into this engineering school, École Polytechnique in Montreal, and targeted women, started to all feminists, and shot and killed 14 of them. And it was a horrendous event in Canada. It was shocking. And so what that did was dramatically the ante and dramatically increased the sense of urgency in dealing with firearms legislation. And, it is true that people often, look to what seems the most obvious resolution to a problem when they're in a sense of crisis and mourning, etc. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't, in fact, a good policy response to that particularly terrible circumstance, because the firearm that the killer had was something that a semi-automatic firearm was legal, but the two 30-shot magazines meant that he could create havoc without ever having to reload. In other words, it dramatically increased the lethality of the firearms he was carrying. So that was the context in which I revisited our firearms legislation and dramatically revised it. So there was that political pressure, while at the same time a sense from the non-urgent side of the thinking in the Justice Department that it was time to review legislation and that there were things that needed to be tweaked and fixed to make it better. But partly because we live next door to the United States, and we have some, quite kind of conservatively rednecky people in our country, there are people who like to adopt American political formulae And so there are, kind of NRA type people in Canada. But in general, I would say, the firearms culture in Canada is different. So although lots of people have firearms, and we have ranchers and farmers and hunters, and our Indigenous people have hunting rights, etc. So we have lots of people who have guns. But the culture of them and the sense that any desire to regulate them or impose good standards of storage and handling and trading requirements, etc., it doesn't create the same backlash and resistance that you get in the United States, where there's almost, if I may use the expression, almost a cult around the notion of the Second Amendment. And people forget the important words of the Second Amendment that talk about a well-regulated militia, which suggests that the Founding Fathers, even whatever they meant by the right to bear arms, they certainly didn't mean a right to bear arms outside of any kind of regulation or appropriate standards for the bearing of those arms. Anyway, so that's a long answer to a short question. But yes, I brought in quite a complex and I think good piece of firearms legislation. And if you want me to go into more detail, I can. If you like.
For sure. I think just generally speaking, the gun culture is different in the United States than it is in Canada, because the United States left the British Empire in a very violent fashion, and Canada left diplomatically in 1867 for the most part.
Well, earlier than that, actually, 1837, really, but 1867 was Confederation.
Yes, but there's like that different culture because a lot of the paranoia around the British taking away our guns was kind of something that stoked it in the early parts of the Revolution, and I feel like that's just kind of carried down with us through the generations. Although, speaking of a militia, I believe you're absolutely correct. There's actually a Supreme Court case from the 1880s. I believe it's Presser v. Illinois, but I would have to check on that essentially said that the individual does not have the right to bear arms, but an organized militia does. I don't think banning guns in the United States is ever going to be practical. We do have a culture such as Canada's with hunting and, sport shooting and all that. But I do think that it's kind of interesting because you had one atrocity like that, and it really changed the narrative. We've had several of that scale in the past half decade, and nothing's really changed. I mean, people are more aware of the issue, unquestionably, but, all in all, nothing's really changed, aside from a bump stock ban.
Well, I think there's also, what has happened in the United States is I think the gun culture has become even more extreme, because the notion that people should be able to have firearms. I mean, there are some people who believe you should be able to have a bazooka if you want one. I mean, this notion of people carrying around really military firearms. There have been regulations, and there has been legislation passed at the state level and quite broad in the United States that has limited the size of magazines and has, and now there is a suggestion that the assault weapon ban should be reinstated, but there was a ban for a number of years. It seemed to have had an impact on the level of shootings. But whereas in Canada, people hunt, they sport shoot, and whatever. But the notion that civilians should be carrying military weapons is not really part, I think, of our culture. There may be a few extreme people who think there should be no limits. But I think, for example, when automatic firearms were banned, I'm not sure that there was much of a constituency among, what I would call regular firearms users to change that, because regular firearms users are people who hunt, and in fact most provinces have a limit on 3 rounds in a magazine for a semi-automatic firearm that's used to hunt. So there are limitations basically based on the notion of safety and fairness. Giving the animals a chance. You can't just go in with a machine gun and mow them all down. So this notion that people should be able to have firearms that are really more designed to kill people in combat situations. I think that is something that is less. It's got less of a rooting or a footing in Canada than it has in the United States.
Oh, yes. I think we can agree that, generally speaking, Americans are more skeptical of their government than Canadians are. So I come from Illinois, but which is kind of a more urbanized state, at least the part of it I live in. But if you go to other parts of the country, there are people who possess weapons like that who legitimately believe that the government may someday take them. They need to be prepared. So I would assume that you have people like that up north, but not nearly in the quantity that we do.
Yeah, no, I mean every country has their wingnuts, and they have them in Europe and elsewhere. But the other thing I would say is that you have another part of your history which is not really matched in Canada, and that is slavery and all that came out of the Civil War. Where there's a whole stream of people actually rewriting the history of the Civil War. And we've seen this in the last few years of the concern about the statues of Confederate heroes. And remember that Robert E. Lee did not want to have the statue put up, and the statues of him were put up in the 1920s. They weren't put up in the aftermath of the Civil War. But where there is a whole ethos, and you see this in white supremacy, and this sense that some people have that the future of white people is endangered. That really doesn't appear to be the case, but that arming, the idea of being armed against black people has a very long history, going back to before the Civil War, but after the Civil War, in the race politics of the United States. And I don't think there's anything even remotely like that in Canada, which isn't to say that Canada doesn't have racists. It doesn't mean, in fact, there was a period before slavery was abolished in Britain when there were some American states that didn't have it, and Canada did. So, but generally speaking, it was abolished in Britain and its empire long before the Civil War. So basically, Canada was a place of refuge for slaves, not a place of slavery. But we're not perfect, and our history is more complex than many Canadians even realize. But this notion of a kind of a race tension that requires you to be armed is not part of Canadian culture. And it's very interesting to read in the last few years some quite remarkable historical treatments of race relations in the United States that I think many Americans don't know about. The depiction of the Civil War in some states, because the K-12 curriculum is a state jurisdiction, that it has been hugely distorted to even remove slavery as an issue, which is kind of remarkable. But this
I have a lot of relatives
of race tension. Yeah,
I have a lot of relatives down south, and this has become decreasingly an issue. But a lot of those high school history textbooks, especially for juniors and seniors, often teach that the Civil War was, about the North bullying the South, which is kind of absurd if you look at the
Northern overreach. Yeah, and it's that is not the case, and there were people right after the end of the Civil War, Calhoun and others, and then you see this after the Brown Board of Education decisions, of people who were trying to kind of push back the gains of the civil rights movement and the enfranchisement of African Americans, etc. By addressing issues like school curriculum that could be dealt with at the state level, and they deliberately sought to have political power at that level.
Oh yes. So I do have one final question for you, since I understand you're on a time crunch, and I greatly appreciate you coming on and talking with us, Madam Campbell. But as you know, Hillary Clinton lost the 2016 election in the United States. And as the first female leader of Canada, there were a lot of articles in local U.S. newspapers, especially on the left side of things, after that election, that said essentially America is too sexist for a female leader. Do you agree with notions like that? I personally do not. I personally support Elizabeth Warren in the presidential primaries. So I disagree with that personally, but there are many on the left and a few on the right who believe that.
Well, I think that the 2016 election proves that that's not the case, because Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did. The fact that lost the Electoral College, and how that happened is still a source of great interest. Was there any hanky-panky? Was there any manipulation? Was there a carefully targeted, voter suppression in the Rust Belt states to try and keep her support down? We don't know the answer to that yet. But I think when people say, and then she was a flawed candidate. Yeah, she was a flawed candidate. She only got 3 million more votes than her opponent. Yes, is that and $3 will buy you a latte if the votes are not in the right place to win the Electoral College. But I think the size of her popular vote is very much a reflection that people were willing to vote for a woman. And when you consider the kinds of things that we know were said about her in the social media attacks on her, the campaigns that really only became visible and understood after the election, considering the kinds of things that they said, that she was, a terrible person and a criminal and wanted to bring in Sharia law and ran a pedophile ring out of a pizza parlor. I mean, all of this lunatic stuff, which was really unprecedented in many ways. I mean, there's always been hate campaigns, going back to the beginning of the American Republic. But I mean, when we know the kinds of attacks that were made on her, and she still got more than 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, I think the notion that Americans would not elect women is patently false. Now, does a woman encounter certain issues and problems? Yes, indeed. There is sexism. There is the challenge of breaking through. There is the discomfort that people have when somebody who doesn't look or sound like anybody else who's done that job is in the running. And so people are often very quick to adopt some kind of negative slander about somebody, like a female candidate, or it could be a candidate of color, whatever, because it helps to reconcile their underlying discomfort that this person doesn't look or sound like the normal people who've done that job, but they don't consciously want to acknowledge that they're either sexist or racist, etc. So those are the kinds of things that non-prototypical candidates will continue to have to deal with. But there was a time when nobody believed a black person could be elected president, and Barack Obama was elected twice. So I think the same thing with women. I think Hillary Clinton, in a sense, was elected president. She got more votes than any presidential candidate ever who wasn't named Obama. So I think the real question is, what are the tactics and techniques that people have today to defeat somebody, whether it's a woman or a man you don't like, that don't rely on mass voting, but that can target using social media and other kinds of campaigns to undermine voter turnout, that can target in very specific ways voters in ways that allow a small shift of votes to have a disproportionate outcome given the importance of the Electoral College. So that's the kind of thinking we have to get into. But I think we also need to understand that when non-prototypical people do a job, there are going to be people who are uncomfortable, people who don't like black people or people who don't think a black person should be president. We're beside themselves, not just over a black president, but a black first family. And all those people who break the mold can do is do the best job they can to create a greater sense of the normality of somebody who looks or sounds like that doing that job. So the fact that the Obama family, for example, behaved in a way that was sort of beyond reproach was a very important part of changing people's sense of, who gets to do that job and who African Americans are. And in the same way for a woman doing that. So there will always be a few human sacrifices and challenges that the game changers will have to face. But I think that based on the results in 2016, the notion that a woman can't be elected president is just, it's just false. The problem is that she has to be very astute in her campaigning strategy to make sure that the Electoral College results are not undermined by attacks on her voting base in ways that she hadn't anticipated before.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with you completely on that. I think a lot of those articles written in the aftermath were just kind of almost sour grapes with the issue, since they came from sources that have previously supported her. So I guess thank you for coming on to our podcast. The Youth Brain Trust is an organization based in the United States, quickly expanding into other states and hopefully Canada and the United Kingdom in the coming years. Our goals are to educate young people on the issues and help them get involved in the political process should they wish. Thank you to former Prime Minister Campbell for coming on. Thank you for your service to Canada. It's been a pleasure.
Well, could I just add congratulations to you in this enterprise. There is nothing more important for young people than to understand the power of their vote. And I think they've seen it in a number of circumstances, both in Canada, United States, and even in Britain, where small differences in a vote can have a huge difference in outcome. And it may seem like one vote doesn't make a difference, but it makes a huge difference. So anyone who's encouraging young people to grasp the challenge of citizenship and take their right to vote seriously and exercise it is really on the side of democracy. So I say to young people, it is, many people have died for all of us to have these rights in our countries, and we have to cherish it. And you're never too young to get interested, and that first election is one that you should grasp with enthusiasm and exercise your franchise. So good on you for engaging young people. It is the hope of the future. Nothing that's important to us will change unless young people grasp their opportunity to vote and make a difference. So congratulations to you, and thanks for having me on your podcast.
No problem. Have a great day.